The next speaker is Thorsten Hens. He's Professor for Financial Economics, Department of Banking and Finance at the University of Zurich. He started in computer science at my old alma mater in Bonn in Germany, and then switched to economies, passed some time in Stanford, coming back to do his habilitation, then escaped to Norway before they got him back to Zurich, and where he is now since 2006 fully installed as a professor for financial economics. His title is Reorganization of the Financial System. Welcome, Thorsten.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm awake to give you my presentation on the reorganization of the financial system. So one thing you should note before I go into the details, the financial system is a rapidly self-organizing system, and it's very difficult as a regulator to direct it in some ways, because when you try to give some rules in this area, there will be other areas, shadow banking and so on, where the system is self-organizing itself. Okay, so let's see what we can do anyway. So here's my little agenda. I start with the roles of the financial system, just for the young people to make clear why do we need a financial system. There are three important roles. One is the intertemporal substitution, that's the economic term, but it's something very simple. When you are young, you want to study. When you're old, you want to retire. In order to do this, you need a financial system. You need somebody to give you income when you are young, and you need somebody to give you income when you want to retire. This means people in the Middle Ages, like me, we have to pay on both sides. So you need a financial system to do this, because at some point we grow older and then we benefit from this financial system, the pension system, for example. The second role is the risk diversification. There's so many risks which we are facing. The farmers are facing risks, but also entrepreneurs are facing risk, and when you study, you face a lot of risk. So we need a system to have risk diversification. And again, a financial market is an efficient way for risk diversification. The third role of a financial system is the information aggregation. That's a bit more abstract, but you shouldn't think in static terms, but you should also have innovation in a system. You should know, is it beneficial to do this company or some other company? So you need to have the right incentives, the right prices, so the financial market or the people knowing about technical things or other things, they should make guesses. What is a good product which we can do? And then you need to have some information system, how these guesses come together. And this comes together on financial markets, futures markets, and so on. So these are the three important roles. You see this picture from Wall Street and Main Street. You can also try to do those without Wall Street, these three important roles. For example, the intertemporal substitution has been done for many, many hundreds of years like this in the so-called extended family. So they are all one family. You have to live with your grandfather, mother, with your children. You cannot go out to study because there was no way you could finance this. And the old ones, they had no way to have nice vacations on Hawaii when they want to retire. So that's one way of solving the intergenerational system. And at least when you are young, you agree that's not the most favorable way. The next is risk diversification. This is a picture from medieval England. You see many, many plots of land, and they have been cut into quite small pieces, and you might wonder, why did they do this? Why didn't they have one big piece of land here, one big piece of land there? The reason is it was a matter of risk diversification. Every farmer got a little piece of land here, close to the forest, a little piece of land here, close to the river, so that he has a risk diversification. When there is a flooding, he would still have some land on the hill. When there is a storm, he would still have some land in the valley. So that was the medieval way of risk diversification, and now we have a stock market for risk diversification. So now we can diversify risk not only in a little community like this, but you can diversify risk globally. Finally, information aggregation. Here are two charts. One is going through both are going through the financial crisis. One chart shows the downgrades which the rating agencies did, and the other shows the credit spreads. And you see clearly that the market was much more efficient than the rating agencies to anticipate the problems in the financial crisis. So these are three good arguments that you should just not abolish the financial market, but at least those three functions should always be around. I'm not the only one saying this, and if you want to read more about this, you can read the book of Neil Ferguson. He goes back to the history of money and he explains how it developed, and he also, he always focuses on the connection between the government and the bond market, which is an interesting connection. The other one is Franklin Allen's book, The Financing the Future. He also goes through many, many examples where financial innovation was very successful for society, for growth, and so on. So I could stop here, but many things went well, in particular, and if you read this book, The Triumph of the Optimist, you see many things which went well, how the financial markets were flourishing, but of course also some things went wrong. Now we have lived through the financial crisis. It's always called the financial crisis. Maybe you might also call the governmental crisis, because it's always symbiosis between the markets and the state, which didn't work. So what went wrong recently, and why are we debating the financial system now? So here is what went wrong in one picture. Here you have a little house in the Midwest of the US, and the wife says to the husband, "I thought we were just buying a house." But indeed, that's not what happened. They were the catalyst of a great pyramid of financial institutions who were speculating on the mortgages which this couple used to finance that house, the so-called subprime mortgage crisis, and a lot of financial institutions used this, securitization and so on, to benefit from these mortgages. These mortgages have been given out at interesting institutions. For example, here, the US Center, you could have got a haircut, make your nails, or get some gifts, or get some mortgages. So it was quite easy to get a mortgage. The problem in the US was when you were giving out a mortgage, you were not reliable for the default of the mortgage taker. In Switzerland, you have Pfandbriefe. In Germany, you have Pfandbriefe. This system didn't work, and indeed, in those countries, you didn't have this real estate bubble. So what happened is a lot of securitization. You have the individual mortgages which got packaged into AAA and AA plus packages, which got repackaged and so on. Or to show it in a different picture, you have a lot of junk here, you put it into a machine, and you have nice, beautiful apples coming out there. So this was the idea of securitization, that you take a lot of junk, by the diversification principle, you make it beautiful, and then you sell it to the people on the market. So all this burst. This is from The Economist, Mr. Housing Bubble. He says, not affiliated with Mr. Internet Bubble, because this was the bubble just before, the Internet Bubble. There's a free balloon mortgage inside. If you take a bath with him, take a bath with the real estate market with Mr. Housing Bubble, and then he says, if I pop, you're screwed. And then you see who got screwed. So you see all the banks who were part of the system, all the banks who got screwed because of the securitization of the mortgages and so on. Then came the rescue. Here's a famous picture where the Swiss government, the National Bank and so on, they decided to rescue this company. Again, that's from The Economist, that's the UBS, and the CEO, he looks into the cheese, the UBS cheese, and he discovers a big hole, right? So this was in The Economist because the British think of Switzerland of having cheese with holes. So then they said, look, they also have banks with holes. So there was this rescue, plan, which meant that the bad assets from UBS went into a so-called bad bank. It went into the national bank. The UBS was recapitalized with money and so on, taxpayers' money. So here's a bad bank. Just to visualize it, because of this rescue strategy, I lost a PhD student, Zoltan Selic. He was my PhD student, and then he was working for the National Bank, and he had to sell the bad assets. He had no time to do his PhD anymore because there were too many bad assets which he had to sell. So finally, there was a lot of nationalizations also. That's an interesting point. I'm sure Bruno Frey will not agree with me. But there are different ways you could rescue a rotten bank. One way is to give it money so that the shareholders are happy, that they don't default. The other way is to say, if we anyway pay for the bank, then let's nationalize it for some time, like the Scandinavians did, and then let's float it again, let's make it public again on the market. So it's a matter of who pays for whom. So temporary nationalization might be beneficial for the society, I think. Not long-term nationalization, of course, but in terms of crisis. So finally, that's one of the guys which we have on the program, came the social unrest. They said, how can this be? The bankers told us they have to have these high salaries because they are so great, and now basically the system collapsed, and now they come and want to get money from the taxpayers. So there was a lot of social unrest. People find it unfair that those guys who are the greatest, they finally come to get rescued. So Occupy Wall Street, I'm also too big to fail, and this type of things. The government debt exploded through that time for many reasons, not only because they put money into the banks, but also they did Keynesian multiplier stories like cash for clunkers, that people could buy rotten cars and those things. But as you can see, the governments are not in a good shape now after the financial crisis. And the last stage was this one. Mr. Bernanke, the helicopter money, the quantitative easing, so that they tried to rescue the system. They tried not to repeat the mistake which Ulrich Wojtek was mentioning from the Great Recession. Before we said it was the Great Recession, now we say it was the first Great Recession because we have experienced there might be other ones. So they tried to do a loose monetary policy, and so far it is successful. And so far, the recession was only 18 months, as Uli Wojtek was saying, and it was not 60-something months as it was in the 30s. But the question is, where shall we put all this money? So the question is, how can we extract all the money? So the last song is not ready. It's not yet clear what happens with all this money. Okay, so now you might say, well, this was terrible because you lived through a period of a severe bubble. There was the American housing bubble, which was turned into a financial crisis, a government deficits exploding, and so on. But if you take a historic perspective, there have always been bubbles and crashes. The first bubble was the so-called tulip bubble. What was the reaction to the tulip bubble? No, we didn't ban tulips. You still have tulips. There are other bubbles, the South Sea bubble. What was the reaction to the South Sea bubble? We still have the South Sea. What was the reaction to the railway bubble? We still have railways. So you should not exaggerate the situation. When you have now the bubble on the real estate market, the financial crisis, I think you still need a financial system. So what is the future? Well, this is important for the young people because currently, in a sense, the rapid changing financial system is reinventing itself. It's reinventing itself because of technological progress, because of social media and other things. So again, the regulator now focuses on the old financial system. The regulator now says the bank bonuses have to be long-term. The regulator says we have to put more capital, in particular in the banks, which are too big to fail. The regulator prints 800 pages in the Dodd-Frank Act and so on, but he misses out on this rapidly dynamic system, which is the innovations which is going on currently. Oops, sorry. So here are the innovations. Let's call it a restart. It's fintech. You might have heard about this. If you pay, for example, now you have payment systems with PayPal or bank wallet, all this is on your iPhone. There's crowdfinancing in the internet, there's wikifolio in the internet. Wikifolio means some investors try to make a fortune, the others can watch how they did it, and then they can co-invest with these investors. You have robo-advisors. You don't need to go to a bank anymore. You can go to the internet. You have a clever system which gives you good financial advice. And on top of all, you have this Bitcoin system. You don't need a bank at all anymore because you have this encryptic way of basically recognizing who is in possession of which amount of Bitcoins. You don't need a bank, but you have this social media coin, let's say the Bitcoin, where in every computer it says that, for example, Rainer Eichberger has 300 million of these Bitcoins. And everybody knows this. You don't need to have a bank where you store this information privately. So now you might say, well, the future is bright. We have reinvented the system. We have all this new media incorporated as a new financial system. The old financial system got killed by the regulators with Dodd-Frank Act and hundreds of regulations. And here comes a new system which is developing on the side. Yet, what is the problem? The new system also has the same problem. It bubbles and crashes. So here's the Bitcoin development in US dollars. It was worth basically nothing a Bitcoin, was worth basically nothing a Bitcoin. Then it went up to something like 50, it stayed at 50 or 40, and then it was a huge bubble, bubbling up to 1,000, like the tulips, like the tulip bubble, or like the railway bubble, or whatever bubble you take, and then the bubble crashed in several phases. So what is my conclusion from this? My conclusion from this is you can change the instruments, you can change the bank to an iPhone, you can change the Swiss francs to a Bitcoin, you can change the manager to a roboter, you can change all these instruments, but what remains in the system is this one, the homo sapiens. So these are people interacting in a social system, whether they interact with the iPhone, whether they interact with New York Stock Exchange, whether they interact with Bitcoins. The problem is they will create bubbles and crashes, these human beings. So if you don't put effort to educate these human beings so that they become a little more like this guy, the Homo economicus guy, it will go on like this forever. After the fintech revolution, we will have other revolutions, but you still have the human beings. They will produce their bubbles and crashes in these other revolutions. So my point this morning is, and I'm a professor, I'm an educationist, so my point is, before you have people participating in a financial system, you have to have those people knowing about the financial system. You have to train them in the school. I have 2 kids at school in Switzerland. My son, he learns complicated things in physics, which are on the curriculum. I don't understand why is it that useful, but he doesn't learn basic things like risk and return trade-offs from finance. There are many important things in economics and politics, I think Rainer would agree, which the people have to learn before they go out there in the society. I'm also propagating something, this is very German, I know, and it will never fly in Switzerland. I propagate a driver's license for investors. And so I say, before you go out there and before you buy oil futures or other funny things, you have to prove that you have understood it so that you don't produce a bubble, so that you know risk and return trade-offs. And this driver's license for investors also solves incentive problem. What is going on at the moment, if you look at the regulations, is that at the point of sale, where the bank is selling you a product, they check your ability of having this product. And so that's a very bad incentive. Why? Because typically the banks have an incentive to sell products which are very risky because they earn a higher margin on risky products than they earn on bonds or ETFs and so on. But the regulator says you need to check whether somebody is suitable for that product. And this checking is done at the point of sales. And I do very many mystery shopping studies, and what turns out to be true in many banks is there is still sales discussion, and at the end of the sales discussion, the banker says, no, this is the right product for you, but if I want to sell it to you, you have to make crosses here and there on this little piece from the regulator, which is called the risk profile. And so my proposal is, first of all, to educate better the human beings before they enter into the financial market, before they buy bitcoins and those things, so that they understand about basics of finance and economics. And secondly, to have a different institution checking this ability before they're allowed to enter and invest in the financial market. Okay, so if you want to read about this, all what I've said has been written much nicer than I can say it here. These are the books which I put up: Financing the Future of Franklin Allen, The Triumph of the Optimists of Dimson, Marsh and Staunton, Neil Ferguson. You can also see the films on the YouTube. He has very nice films to illustrate the ascent of money. What is always a good read is Kenneth Galbraith's about speculative bubbles. The German version is Eine kurze Geschichte der Spekulation. So he explains what are the typical mistakes which are repeated again and again. And I hope that at some point we don't repeat this again and again. And then, of course, the never-ending cycle of regulation, deregulation, re-regulation. So this never-ending cycle, we should also understand. The financial system will be regulated, deregulated, and then it finds a way out of this and invents itself, like at the moment the fintech, but then fintech will be regulated, re-regulated, and then again the system finds a way out of that. Okay, so now we have lots of time to discuss. Thank you very much for your patience.
Dear Thorsten Hens, you are pleading for the homo economicus and more education. That's surely okay, also a driver license. But what's about the incentive systems? How did they influence the bubble creation? And how could they prevent it? We should perhaps not only influence the cognitive level, but also the attitude and the real behavior, the behavior of responsibility. And do you see any chance in adequate incentive systems to influence it? Not only the education, not only learning how it functions and driver license, yes, but also an attitude license.
I think these incentive systems are very, very important, but thinking in terms of the incentive system is a very static thought, because then you think about one situation, how can you put the incentives right in this situation, like not giving the bankers a too high bonus and so on. So then you do it, you write the Dodd-Frank Act and all this, so basically you regulate this system, and then on the side there will be development of some other system with bad incentives again. And so it's a very static thought. When you come from a dynamical systems approach, you will see, okay, you can regulate this system, but the system will reinvent it on the side and do something else, with bad incentives again on the other side. And so there's a competing race where you regulate here, and then the system invents itself on the side, and again you have bad incentives in the new system. And so I think it's very good to have good incentives, but it's a very static thought. This ignores that the system is always inventing itself on the side, so where all the regulation does not bind.
Rainer.
I could absolutely, of course I liked the talk, so it was very interesting to listen to you, but I absolutely could not understand your turnaround when you said it's the problem of at the individual level. So, and we need education here. But because before you told us all these nice stories about the banks, and of course these were all highly educated people there, so the problem obviously exists also with highly educated people. And when you think about, for me it's always, chess is quite good an analogy. If people play chess better, then of course they just, all the problems arise at the more sophisticated level. And I imagine a world with all perfect homo economici. Of course there will also be bubbles, because there will just be more sophisticated bubbles. Bubbles are just the result of interaction of humans in a specific institutional environment. Look at politics, there are also bubbles, a lot of bubbles in politics. And so I think one should rather think about the incentives of all these actors and not really to educate them. The education is endogenous to the incentives, of course,
yeah,
but give them incentives, then they are educated to the right level.
The first answer is the same as before. If you think about incentives, you regulate the existing system and the system will reinvent itself without those incentives. Then you're always behind. Then you have to go behind that system and try to put better incentives. So there's a lot of experimental research on bubbles. And the experimental research on bubbles says you can do many, many changes in the system. You can forbid short sales, or you can do this and that. But the only thing which helps is repetition. So when you have the same people invited again, they have learned to avoid this bubble. So that's the, if you read Smith and Suchanek and the others, the most...
They only learn to evade this bubble, but as soon as you have educated everybody, of course, the games will change. Now they will change a different game, and then you have the bubble problem.
It's a matter of how you learn. If you learn very specific, if you learn, I shouldn't engage in a tulip bubble, then you haven't learned anything. So if you learn more on a broader area, saying I shouldn't engage in bubbles, then you have learned something. And look at the Bitcoin bubble. There was no bank, there was no managers who got paid for creating the bubble. This was like the tulip bubble. It was a bubble on a little object which actually you cannot see, but I have to put it on the slide. Bubble on a little object in the internet which you cannot see, and yet people got crazy for this without any banks or adverse incentives, principal agent problems. So I don't think but maybe it's not nice to you and others working on the field, I think this incentive view is a little bit overrated, and the dynamic view will tell you there will always be ways to avoid your incentives, and then you create a different system with the same mess as before.
Next question, Peter Seele. And then
Thank you very much for the talk. I very much enjoyed it. I share the basic outline. There's one detail I'm a little concerned, and I'm afraid I need to get a little philosophical on that. The Homo sapiens and the Homo economicus. Of course, we have other ideas like Homo culturalis, socialis, ludens, and so on and so forth. But if I'm not mistaken, we, as a species, are referred to not as Homo sapiens, but as Homo sapiens, sapiens. Those who know that they are knowing. And I was wondering, even in this meta level, we already have the capacity to reflect upon who we are and what we do. And if not, this reflection should guide us also in making decisions that prevent the negative examples you've given.
But this is let's say, the ultimate stage. You have gone through mistakes, you learn from your mistakes, and you learn that you make mistakes. So then you are on a higher level in a sense. But the Bitcoin bubble, for example, it wasn't produced by me, it wasn't produced by people retiring, it was produced by young people. So there is always a new young generation coming which have not yet made this learning. And so that's the problem. We have to learn from the history, because then we can learn from the mistake of the others. But if we want to learn from ourselves, it works, but then the young generation comes and produces its own bubble. And so we live in overlapping generations. So I'm a little less optimistic that the learning process of the population itself is quick enough to avoid those bubbles, because there will always be fresh people coming and they will repeat the mistakes.
So good morning, Mr. Hens, and thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one, okay, now we see incentive doesn't help very much, education doesn't help very much, learning doesn't help very much. So as Generation Y, I want to bring in a futuristic technical approach. Yesterday we heard about wearable technologies, right? We use them to measure our health, our fitness. What if people start using it to make better decisions? Like if those things can tell me when I am in the perfect mental state and when I am calm enough to do good decisions, and then I invest. Something like the investor driver license, but...
That's a very, very good point. I did some consulting for a German internet broker. The people came to me to Zurich and they said I should help them. And I said, I don't think I will be useful for you because I would basically tell your people not to trade as much. Then they told me, no, it's even worse than you think. The people investing in our internet platform, and it's the biggest in Germany, they ruin themselves after 1 year. And then I say, okay, I can help you. I programmed a very clever thing, a behavioral finance advice. So whenever they trade at the wrong moment, there was a finger saying, oh, you did this mistake before. The success was, now they need 2 years to get ruined.
Okay.
So it was successful for the bank.
Very interesting, thank you. And the second question is about Bitcoin. Okay, there was the Bitcoin bubble, but now what we are using is the blockchain technology behind Bitcoin. That is somehow surviving, right?
Yes,
UBS and CS are already trying it out.
Yes, that's a
very,
very good point, which is in line with what I was saying. I said there was a tulip bubble and we still enjoy tulips. There was the railway bubble and we still go with the railway. There was the Bitcoin bubble and we still use blockchain. So there's always innovations occurring with those bubbles, and we take the best of this, even though there has been the failure, there has been the crashes in the bubble. There is Alex Tobler sitting close to you. He wrote his master thesis on that. So if you have speculation, then it looks all nasty, but eventually there are positive externalities, so something remains. So from that sense, it's not that bad that we have these exaggerations like speculation and bubbles.
Well,
first and then you.
I personally believe that the problem is not that humans don't behave enough of a homo economicus. Today we have 70% of transactions done by computers. These computers use sophisticated machine learning technology, neural networks, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and all these kind of things. And we know there are flash crashes, for example. So I think the issue is that we are basically surfing on top of noise. There are amplification and cascading effects. So basically positive feedback is what produces bubbles and crashes. This is what we need to think about, how to get rid of this positive feedback if we want to do that.
Yes, so I agree many decisions are not made by humans anymore, but if you have programs benefiting from positive feedback, it's the same mess. And then you also can create bubbles. Concerning the high-frequency trading and all this, I'm not that optimistic that there are major decisions taken by those programs, because most of those programs are very short-term. They clear the balance within seconds and milliseconds. So I see this like autopilots, and still you need somebody in severe periods to steer the portfolio. And so I don't think the major decisions are made by the programs. I think they are doing the smaller decisions like stabilizing your portfolio or trying to make short-term gains, but the major decisions are made by pension funds, for example. When the stock market goes down, a pension fund is de-risking. So these are major decisions. When the stock market goes up, a pension fund has a higher coverage ratio and they take more risks. So this builds the big swings. This high-frequency trading, they wouldn't produce big bubbles, I think.
Alan Tierman.
Yeah, I was just to follow up on those last 2 points. The whole automation of the process, as you said, well, this is really just correcting or doing these very, very short-term trades. But even that, for example, there's this famous book, I forgot what it's called now, Flash Boys or something like this, where just because of technology, people can get an edge on other people by getting their order in, knowing that somebody's made an order here, I can anticipate him and get in there. So they can also generate movements which you wouldn't have had before. But the other thing was, as you said, these things are programmed by humans in the end. And if you don't tell your programmers anything about what they're doing, and you just say, put in stop-loss orders, and they all say, well, at what price should I do that? And they all put it in at the same number, then that can be a disaster too. So they just choose round numbers. And when it hits that, we get something like the flash crash, right? So there's this combination of, on the one hand, people playing with the technology to exploit each other, and also the fact that the programmers don't realize the consequences collectively of what they're doing.
Yes, I'm not so worried about these flash crashes, right? Because when you look at the portfolio like a pension fund once a month, you don't even notice those flash crashes. And so it's very interesting when you're a little animal like a high-frequency trader, that's a lot of action for you, but when you are a big elephant like a pension fund, a flash crash, you don't notice this. So I'm more worried about the big money makers, the pension funds, the prop traders in the banks, and those decisions. When they de-risk, when they take more risk, I think these are the more severe swings than the nitty-gritty changes of high-frequency trading, which might result into a flash crash for a second, and the next second it's over. So I don't worry about this. It's beyond my reaction time, these flash crashes.
I have 5 more questions on the list. Please.
Yeah, I'll be brief. First of all, I see this happening in my country and elsewhere, also in the developing world. People who started buying shares unrealizingly get into buying options, futures, etc. Certainly you need a driving license, and I would say which has to be regularly renewed, because with now high-speed computers, there are people who are at a much lower level of understanding of these issues are competing with those at a much higher level. And maybe some course can be put online where you have to at least go through that online course before you can start buying or selling things that are a little more advanced than shares. Now, my only question, I think this also relates to insurance, and maybe I see it in my country where insurance companies sell insurance policies, and then they use the money they generate to make money on the stock market, etc. And I see a little bubble in many countries that might be emerging there. So maybe this kind of driving license for insurance companies or agencies also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are training programs on the internet. So I have written programs, professors from Berkeley have written programs. The only problem is people don't really take it serious because it's just a game. So what we are doing at the moment is we do a flight simulator. So we have a sponsor which gives us good money, and we buy a flight simulator to fly a big plane with passengers, and we reprogram it for the financial market. And then the hope is, because you get a lot of movements, you are shaken when your returns go down, then people take it more serious. So these tools on the internet, they drink a coffee, they laugh at it, and they don't take it serious. So we think we have to bring in more action, like in the flight simulator.
Okay. Next one, Marcus.
Well, just one input I learned yesterday, that economists like random walks. And I know, or I read about an experiment by journalists. They just pinned the names of big companies on the wall, and then they played dart, just blind, and the asset allocation by this experiment was better than one lead by rational calculations. So just a random walk that you can be as good as if you're going with programs and so on.
Yes, that's a famous study. The monkey who throws the darts on the Wall Street Journal is not that bad, right? But this only says you need to go to Uli Wojtek in a statistics course, because there are some factors where not with 100%, but maybe with 2 or 20 or something percent, you can make some extra in the long term. So there, if you read Farmer French and others, so you see there are some factors, so it's not hopeless. So the monkey, of course, doesn't understand Farmer French, but there is some hope.
Okay, first, thank you very much for your speech. What I like to say is, when you were talking about the roles of the financial systems, you mentioned these 3 roles, and I mean, this could be called a functional approach towards the discussion of the financial system. And so I had to think about the distinction of Max Weber. I mean, he used the term ideal type in order to make these discussions of the functions of a particular system. And I mean, the opposite of an ideal type is sort of a real type, isn't it? And I mean, I was working for a long time on psychiatry, for example, and when we talk about psychiatry, this ideal type of psychiatry in our society is that we think of an institution which heals mental diseases. But the real type of psychiatry, especially in history, has been to expose people and to separate somewhat weird people from the rest of society, which seemed to be normal, which understood itself as normal. So, I mean, given this background, I think your presentation of the role of the financial system is sort of a discussion of an ideal type of the financial system. And I think that the real function, or one real function, I don't want to say it's the real function, but one real function of the financial system is to legitimize enormous individual benefits at other people's expenses as well. And that's inherent in the system, immanent in the system. For example, when Apple exploits its employees in China who work for 14 hours per day, every day, under very bad conditions, this problem has nothing to do with speculation or bubbles, I think. That's much more, I would say it's a practice that is inherently legitimized by the financial system we have nowadays. And when we look at, for example, indigenous people in Brazil who are expropriated, and then their forests, or let's say their lands, are taken away, that's as well an inherent system. It's inherently legitimized in the system. Or for example, my neighbor who worked, I mentioned that yesterday, worked like for 2,000 euros per month. Then he was sort of fired, and afterwards he was offered the same job for 40% less of salary. So these are all inherent problems of the system, and that's not bad functioning, but they're direct consequences of this system.
I think this is valid concerns, but yet I would like to retire. I mean, I need to have intertemporal consumption smoothing. So there's certain things like saving for when you get old, or I want to ensure my health. These are functions which you cannot discuss away, even though you might at the moment have a financial system which is abused by others, but you still need to have a system which helps young people to study, which helps old people to retire, which helps to insure risk, and so on. So I know the current system is doing it, and maybe the current system is also used as an excuse, or it's helping to do many bad things, but at least it does the 3 good things.
For some people.
But at least for those I see here, you have money to study, and some others have money to retire. So at least for those I see here, it seems to work.
Final question.
Okay. Mine is more sort of a comment than a question. I like your proposal of educating people, especially on financial stuff before they venture into financial markets. As a financier, I would also like to recommend that we as the people in the industry should also make things simple. Like we should try and help the local or the simple, I would not like to say simple, but we should make things easier, not use complicated stuff like, derivatives and securitization, which makes it very hard and displeasing for people to study.
Yes, that's a very important point. And now I say something which Rainer might like. That's maybe also a problem of bad incentives, that bankers have the incentive to make things more complicated than they are because they want to show that they have better knowledge. But they should make it more simple.
Final request.
Quick one. I'm coming back to the incentives and to the education. So coming from the business world, I know hundreds of business with a lot of incentives, and at the end of the day, there was a lot of bubbles. So take care, the word incentive is not so easy. Now, coming to the education, despite that I like the word, I think we need a homo ethical. So we know in this type of jobs, we have to find a very ethical face. Otherwise, we are going to have bubbles. Thank you.
So I agree.
So this was then the closing remark to be discussed during coffee break, which we have now. Please be back 10:30. Thank you very much.